Welcome to the Perennial Podcast, brought to you by Perennial Music and Arts, where creativity blooms. Visit us at www.perennialmusicandarts.com. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Janae, and this is the Perennial Podcast. For our first conversation, I spoke with composer and educator Dante Prevedini. John was kind enough to reach out after reading my article, Beauty is in the Eye and Ear of the Beholder, 5 Examples of Organ Music, or Eye Music, which is available in the episode links. John has composed many works of organ music himself and was eager to share his process. We also spoke about the significance of music theory and history for both music students and professionals, how social media influences art, and much more. Hello, John. Thanks so much for speaking with me today. The first thing I would like to talk about is your eye music compositions, organ music compositions. What inspired you to begin composing in this way?
Well, I've always been sort of vaguely aware about organ music because when I was a young teenager, I first became interested in the music of the medieval period. And one of the most interesting aspects of that period in music history is that this organ music genre first begins to appear in the record. Now, there may be older examples that we're not aware of or that I'm not aware of, but it really begins to appear in a way that's recognizable as such in the late 14th century thereabouts. And this was sort of on the back burner in the back of my mind for years and years and years. Independently of this, later on, by the time I was, probably in my late 20s, early 30s, which was a few years ago, I started experimenting with the whole process of transcribing visual contours into a melodic content. So, for example, landscape, the shapes of hills, the shapes of natural objects, and so on and so forth. But it didn't really hit me to go on fully into organ music as a 21st century art form until the COVID lockdown. And part of this is because, well, obviously we as musicians were all in a situation where concert performances were impossible. And one of the things that I started asking myself is, how can we as composers shift the focus so that we can experiment with the possibilities of social media? Now, we were all stuck on social media. Even if we were performing in small groups, whether virtually or as solo performers, we were still, for most of us, we were tied to the limits of what social media could present. Now, for composers, especially composers of new music, it can be a potentially challenging situation to continue audience cultivation, building audiences, because the visual element is such an inherent part of social media culture. And in fact, it's sort of the default mechanism for the format by which content is experienced. And case in point, look at all the different visually formatted platforms there are in social media. We have YouTube, TikTok, Pinterest, Facebook. So there's so many other platforms that
Instagram.
Right. But for composers, what do we have? I mean, pretty much SoundCloud is the default standard. Only the only sort of dominant audio focused social media platform that comes to my mind that all people sort of have equal access to in terms of creators. And so
to do like a Bandcamp account as well, but
true, good point. Bandcamp, but still, I mean, the options are relatively limited compared to the options we have as the content creator in the visual realm. I would even put Twitter in there as well. It's much easier, I would say, in the general culture and format of social media to build audiences if you were a creator of visual or very short verbal content. So hashtags, tweets, memes, emoji, those sorts of things, as well as photography and short videos seem to do well. Not just in terms of the format of social media, but also the attentional culture. I think we can safely say, and there's certainly some evidence to back this up, that social media, as we know it, has been around a little more than a decade now. It's beginning to shape the way that our culture experiences attention. And so one thing that I often go back to is the economics of attention. So if you, let's say that you are scrolling through your social media feed and you see two posts, both by content creators that are unfamiliar to you. Maybe one of these posts you see is, let's say, a very attractive photo of a sunset on the beach that takes 10 seconds to see by a photographer you don't know anything about. And the other link is an inaudible thumbnail to an audio demo that takes 4 minutes to hear by a composer you know nothing about. All things being equal, which would you be more likely to click on? An image that takes 10 seconds to see, or an audio that takes 4 minutes to hear? And for that reason, I say that a picture is worth 1,000 notes. And this is, to me, it's easy to say that, but in the spring months of 2020, when we were all in lockdown, and I was sort of, as a composer, having this existential question about how the heck can we as composers build audiences in this state, in this sort of limbo where we can't perform our music, and where it's so hard to build audiences using the culture and the format of social media and this sort of visual preference that the format lends itself to. And then I started thinking back gradually to Augenmusik, but not just Augenmusik, other forms of music notation that are compact, maybe on one page, or are really visible. In other words, that can convey something, not everything, but something about the music in a visual way quickly, as if it were a photograph. So in other words, an Instagrammable score, so to speak. So that was sort of the genesis of how I sort of got into this series of experiments, reinventing music composition to work well in the visual culture of social media.
What I think is interesting about the examples of your music that I've listened to and watched is how it's both interesting to look at, but also sounds pleasing. It doesn't just sound like noise. I mean, you can look at, I don't want to specify any specific composers, but there's some really interesting scores from, for example, the mid-20th century. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's hard to digest, I suppose would be a way to put it. It's very something you have to become accustomed to, I guess, auditorily. So I like how you were able to combine a pleasing image with a pleasing sound.
Well, it's certainly within my training to consider the sonic aspects of a musical composition. But there are other factors too that I would like to mention about that. And the first is that Augenmusik, if you study the history of it, it has a really long tradition going back to the Middle Ages, as I've mentioned. But for most of that history, arguably up until just several years ago, until the age of social media, Augenmusik was something of an inside joke between the composer and the performer, because the audience will almost never see the score. So it sort of came with this assumption that whoever was going to be seeing the music was a musician and would have some background knowledge, assumed background knowledge about how notation works. Now, what I think is different today is this was sort of a fringe genre, a sort of a novelty, if you will, for centuries and centuries. But within the past maybe 3 years or so, there's been an explosion of Augenmusik on social media and in traditional media like Interlude.hk, Classic FM, all the standard social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and what have you, and Pinterest and Instagram. And what you see is a lot of composers and musicians sharing not just newly composed Augenmusik, but also some of the older examples, like you mentioned in the mid-20th century. I think some of the best-known composers from that genre, or from that era, are probably George Crumb and John Cage. Crumb especially. Those scores are being shared now alongside the medieval and Renaissance period scores. What I think is really different about this day and age is you see general audiences being exposed to this music and responding very well to it. And so it sort of creates this incentive to, or at least a precedent, to explore how to make this music visually accessible to non-musicians so that even they can understand something about the structure of the sound of the music by looking at it visually, even if they're not trained musicians. And I think that's potentially a gold mine for community outreach, whether you're talking about using music as a way to expand the audience for new art music, but also other people who may not be musicians themselves, but may find potential in how to use Augenmusik as an educational tool, or a tool for social activism, or a tool for other kinds of qualitative research about phenomenology, about communication in the broad and in the deep senses of the term. So I think this is an exciting time for Augenmusik. Not everyone who engages with it may even be aware that there is such a term for this, or that there is a long history of this as sort of a fringe or an esoteric technique that now suddenly has a broader mainstream potential of relevance and relatability.
Absolutely. If you've gone to any music conferences or anything of that in the last few years, they've been talking so much about the importance of the visual. For example, my graduate education was in computer music, and that was a huge part of making music with the computer, was making a way to make it visual. Because that's another example of something where you're missing that visual performance aspect that you see when you see someone play the piano or when you see someone sing. There's like an emotional connection there. That visual aspect, whether it be music that's traditionally composed or composed with a computer, enables regular people to relate to it without having the luxury of seeing a performance. You had mentioned a little bit about music education in there, and I'm sure the last few years have been a huge challenge for music teachers, especially the ones who've been doing a lot of remote learning, either through lessons or in the case of classroom teachers having to do like those Zoom classes. How do you think things like Augenmusik or algorithmic composition techniques can enhance the music education experience?
That's, I think, a very, very big question with a lot of potential angles for exploration. The first thing that comes to my mind is that as teachers, one of the things that we always have to consider is how to engage the active participation of our students at all levels. They could be college age, they could be members of the general public, they could be in the younger grades as well, but finding ways to actively involve people in the learning process. And I think one way that Augenmusik does that is it engages multiple learning styles simultaneously. There's a visual element, there's a sonic element, there are kinesthetic elements in the sense that we feel rhythm, we feel melody, we feel harmony, especially if we're performing Augenmusik, but there's also the potential of transcending the senses with language. A title that's well conceived and well strategized can direct the attention in the experience of the physical or the visual image and also the sonic structure. So, for example, if you have a piece that you want to use that teaches a musical concept, or even a non-musical concept, like let's say that you want to teach something about geography or about chemistry or about world languages or history. Imagine a piece of Augenmusik where you have a visual image that gets a concept across, but at the same time, there's something about the musical structure that conveys a natural process or the feeling of a historical event. And then at the same time, you have a title that focuses the verbal attention. So all of these things have the potential to come into play and engage with different aspects of learning. That's just one aspect in itself of Augenmusik. Another is the participatory element. You also mentioned algorithmic compositions. Now, algorithmic compositions, they may include Augenmusik, they may not. That's a whole separate dimension that can't exist on its own. And algorithmic compositions can, for our listeners and our readers who may not be familiar with the term, algorithmic composition refers to composition based on logical processes that convert one sort of information into another. So how do you convert information about the natural world around you into musical information that might engage with someone who has more of a musical way of making sense of the world. Gardner talks about multiple intelligences, with musical intelligence being one of them. So maybe music is not just an activity, but a way of making sense of other subjects. And how do you engage people in the active process of realizing an algorithmic performance? I know this is a lot of different angles to the question you're asking, and that's just scratching the surface. These are all different things that I'm exploring simultaneously as I compose, as I test this music, as I do research about how other Augenmusik practices and algorithmic practices from the past have potential today.
Kind of relating to that is, I would say Augenmusik is almost like a technology. Well, it's more of a process. But speaking of music technology, how does that play a role in your music creation? And what kind of technology? Are you looking to just pen and paper? Are you looking to the computer? Are you looking for inspiration, like you had mentioned, social media?
I use technology constantly as a composer. Every single thing that I use to aid in the act of composition involves some stage of technology, whether it's the piano, whether it's music notation, whether it's a software program to produce scores, or whether it's audio realization technology. It plays into every aspect, and technology is nothing new. When you look at medieval manuscripts that are written using different colored inks and using different notational conventions, that's engaging with cutting edge technology too in that time and place. So technology is not a new thing. We're in a new chapter of it now, and new chapters will be opened to us after this. It's an ongoing process.
So yeah, there's no like end point where it's like, oh, we've reached the pinnacle of what we can develop. We're always innovating and changing our toolkit.
Well, one thing that I do think about with social media is not just the technological possibilities, but the cultural and linguistic and communicational implications of how that technology is shaping the way that we interact with each other. I mean, when you look at social media being a visual place, being a place that overwhelms us constantly with material to engage our attentions, it sort of produces evolutionary pressure to evolve the way we communicate with one another. We're speaking in shorter sentences. We're engaging in sound bites that affect people based on how powerful our emotions are, how condensed our symbolism is, how direct and how almost familiar, I would say, our language is. And we're much more repetitive. I think you're more likely to see a sameness in communication style and communication content when there is social pressure to use the same style of language and to use memes and to use tweets and to use hashtags that sort of codify and regularize the idioms through which we communicate emotions and facts and concepts to each other.
And also, like you're speaking of the visual aspect, I mean, the emoji aspect of communication and just the sending pictures as a way to communicate, like you were saying before. I mean, you look at a photograph and you get the information right then and there. So what tools do you consider indispensable as a composer? What would you have to have or you could not create music?
Well, honestly, the most indispensable tool I think I have as a composer is language.
Okay.
Because language, in the absence of anything else, language can communicate intent. Now, this is the funny thing, whenever you look to the frontiers of notational practice and development, you will see composers using plain vernacular language to communicate their intentions. We all know what pizzicato and tremolo are now, but at one time that wasn't something to be taken for granted. And composers like Monteverdi, who pioneered those tools, have explained what was meant by them. Concepts like piano and forte, we take musical dynamics for granted. But when composers like Gabrieli were pioneering those terms, they had to be explained. And so there are intentionalities behind the conventions that we use today that are forgotten or easy to forget because we take them for granted. And I think even today that process is still playing out. To this day, there are composers who do not have standard notation conventions to easily communicate their intents, because quite frankly, there hasn't been a need. There hasn't been evolutionary pressure to make notation do those things on a regular basis. So composers still rely on language to explain what they mean. And I think that's especially true when you look at contemporary open form or algorithmic compositions that involve live process, interactive process, et cetera. So I would say to this day, language is still the most powerful tool that I have as a composer, and I would say that other composers have a similar relationship with language.
Oh, that's a really good choice. Thinking about your creative process, do you have a specific method? Are you one of those people who composes when you feel inspired, or do you set yourself a schedule? Do you say, I'm going to write music today from 1 until 4, for example?
It completely depends on the piece. It depends on the occasion, the reason for the piece, what the piece has to accomplish, what the client needs the piece to do. So if I'm composing for a school that simply needs a piece to fulfill the needs of an unusual ensemble, then I know that, okay, I need to write this piece for these instruments. And then on top of that, maybe there are other demands that the piece needs to meet, like performance time, difficulty level. Maybe the piece is meant to teach a certain concept in the curriculum. Maybe they're learning about how to play slurred notes or marcato notes. And then that's when I would start incorporating, okay, here are the demands of what this performance needs to do. On the other hand, if it's for pure experimentation and testing the limits of what the medium can do, then I have more self-direction. Then I look into the question of, all right, as a composer, what do I want my exploration of this concept to reveal to me? What do I want to test about the capabilities of this form or this medium or this genre of music that I'm drawing upon in this latest experiment, etc. So it really depends on the piece.
Sounds like you find having a limitation or a goal in mind when you start really helps you accomplish your goal as a composer. I feel that limitations really help, or having a deadline. Otherwise, you just keep, where I find myself, you just keep doing it over and over and over again, and then you hate it by the time.
I think it was Bernstein who said that to achieve great things, you need a plan and not quite enough time.
Yes, I kind of think that might definitely be something composers and songwriters in general need to keep in mind, that, we have to have a point where this piece is done. Don't overwork it like a dough, it won't rise.
Right, absolutely. You don't overwork it, and you don't over or underprove it. You got to strike the iron while it's hot, so to speak.
What do you think is different for you as a composer versus someone who's a performer? And how do you feel that you practice, quote unquote? Do you feel that practicing an instrument helps you compose? Do you feel that just composing regularly helps you practice? What are your thoughts on practice and the difference between the role of the composer and the role of a performer?
That is a wonderful question. I do think that there are many helpful ways to practice different aspects of composition. The compositional process itself has many dimensions to it, and each of those dimensions benefit from practice. If you use counterpoint in your compositional process, practice your counterpoint. If you use improvisation in your compositional practice, practice your improvisation. If you use score engraving, practice that. Practice your score engraving. Any individual aspect of your process that you use as a composer is something you can practice. And I practice as much as I can with 24 hours in the day with all of those individual dimensions. And even after going on probably 20 years or something in composing, I have a lot to improve upon and a lot that I want to get better at in all these different dimensions. The work never stops, and it's a lifelong relationship. So I would say for composers who want to practice, just dive right into it. Know what you want to do and just do it as much as possible, and watch yourself doing it. Watch how you do it and observe yourself. and be open to the mistakes that come when you're practicing. That's the place to make mistakes.
Yes, exactly. And I think for a lot of musically inclined people, they tend to be very hard on themselves when they make mistakes. I remember hearing from a college professor that he was talking about his wife who conducted a middle school band. And she would tell the middle school band, don't be so hard on yourself. Music is the only thing where you fail at 90%. Like, does that make sense? Like the whole level of perfection is so much higher in music than it is in other fields, that I think musicians tend to be a little bit too hard on themselves when they're practicing, when it's, okay to try something and fail. Does that make sense?
I think it makes great sense. And on the other hand, I think technology is partly to blame for that extreme anxiety. And the reason I say that, I think one of the most valuable tools that any music student can access is the Library of Congress audio database. Because in the Library of Congress, they have archived hours of audio material from the turn of the 20th century. And these are home recordings made on wax cylinders. So these are not professional musicians. These are regular people who lived in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, who were making music at home. And these people are clearly non-professional performers who absolutely are engaged with what they're doing, who love what they're doing, and their culture, their community, their family life, their social network. In a social network in the sense of that generation, they all supported it. And there was not this pressure to be perfect musicians, because music was something everybody did. It was just a part of everyday life. And there wasn't a pressure to be a flawless, polished performer constantly. Nowadays, we are absolutely flooded with so it's a quote unquote perfect recordings of professional musicians. And so it creates this pressure to hold up to that level. And that pressure is a very modern phenomenon. I think people have to remember that there is value in non-professional music making, that it's not just so you can be a musician as a career, but so that you can be a well-rounded human being and member of your community, to engage with them at the musical level.
Yeah, and just going on TikTok, I know I've seen accounts where they're like, this is so-and-so singer without the quote-unquote auto-tune. Usually it's not even auto-tune. It's just they stripped whatever the processing is off of it. But that's a difference between a professional mix and someone singing raw. I mean, you just can't compare them. It's not fair to the singer. And some singers, for example, speaking of singers, have voices that work really well in a mix, in a band setting, for example, but maybe they don't sound as pretty a cappella. But there's other singers who are great choral singers who might not sound as great in the more popular genres. Does that make sense?
Absolute sense.
You need to take something in the right lane where it's coming from.
I think an important aspect of that is that it creates an unnatural expectation for what the human voice should do, or, well, metaphorically, what the human performing of an instrument should do. Almost analogous to when we look at magazine covers of models that are photoshopped and airbrushed, and you don't even know it. If you look at the unedited photos that people take for fashion magazines, they show models in their natural state, and it can be vastly different from the finished product. And I think that technology of audio processing can create something like that for musicians who are listening to a performance and may not realize that what they're hearing is actually an unnatural result, that is not the consequence of pure human skill.
There's also this whole aspect, they're in a perfect room using perfect microphone. They recorded it 750 times, you don't even know that, to get that final result. There's just so much in there that you can never have in a natural, real environment. It kind of creates, like you're saying, an illusion that doesn't really exist, just like the photoshopped cover of Vogue, for example. Like,
Right.
Something you just cannot possibly, it's just not possible to emulate it live. And frankly, for some of those performers who are even at that level, who might be, whether they're popular musicians or classical, quote unquote, musicians, it also kind of unfair to them, because when people do see them live, they can never meet up to the standard of the recording or the video that people saw, you know? It creates this whole illusion of something that just cannot exist.
And I also do think that there's something about our culture. If you study the different performance traditions around the musical cultures of the world, many traditions are performance-based, are participatory and not performance-based. So if the cultural value of a musical tradition is participation, and playing an active role, the act of doing the music, as opposed to performing for an audience who's not involved in the performance, and they are simply spectators. They are simply a pure audience. That's an important thing that we, I think, in Western cultures need to bear in mind. And that is, when you look at musical traditions in the Western world 100 years ago and before, participatory music was a much bigger part of the musical experience for the population. Now we have, I think many of us have outsourced music to performers, and we have forgotten that there is a participatory value to music making, not just a music making to provide music for an audience at a performance, if it makes sense.
It's a really great point. Yeah, you definitely, if you think about the past, they had like those large choral traditions, for example, where people would come together and sing, or they would come together with their instruments. Local brass bands used to be a huge deal in Britain, for example. So
absolutely,
definitely kind of lost something there. Though once in a while, you do kind of see like little tiny sparks that it's still there's enough interest that maybe we can reignite that, and maybe we could even reignite that with tools like social media. For example, you've seen those videos on TikTok or other platforms? I know there was the one band that was somewhat successful on YouTube many years ago, where they would record over the other one and then kind of like duet it and make a whole piece. You can kind of like improvise and play music with other people, even though you're not in the same room.
I don't know if I'm familiar with the specific video that you're describing, but I have seen other videos like that involve remixing and overdubbing and adding to a performance.
Yeah, it's just kind of a general thing. I can't remember the name of the guy. I know there was one guy on YouTube who did it with himself, where he would play all the instruments. It was like 10 years ago. Then now I feel like with TikTok being having the ability to duet, I've seen a lot of people doing that. Like they'll play the cello, and then someone else will come in with the French horn, and someone else will scat.
Oh, that's wonderful. I remember the sea shanty craze last year around this time with the wonderful interpretations of the sea shanties that were viral on TikTok. That was something that was so unexpected, and I think it put that technology to really wonderful use as a community tool for participatory music making. That, I think, is a really great example of how technology can be used to foster participatory music making.
Well, you've brought up some things from music history and how the medieval period has impacted you as a composer, but how did studying music theory and music history impact you? And do you have a preferred era, for example, the classical, romantic, modern, or a preferred composer like Stravinsky, Debussy?
I would say that to answer the question of preferred era or preferred composer, that is completely and totally subjective based on my cultural background, my life experiences, my time and place, and my personality. So what really, really speaks to me and opens new doors for my imagination and inspiration may not work for somebody else. So I would encourage everybody to take their own journey with all of these composers and all of these periods of music. I think I'll answer your questions in the reverse order. So your second question was, for me, historical periods and practitioners. I have always felt very drawn to the the medieval period, yes, but also I would say the beginning of the Baroque era. So Monteverdi, Heinrich Schütz really speak to me in terms of their text painting, their use of drama in musical form. I'm also very drawn to William Byrd. I've recently begun describing his music as sort of a fusion between an emotionally deep lyricism, but also a sense of forward momentum in the rhythmic and contrapuntal texture of his music. I would say that my relationship with Byrd's music, particularly his instrumental works, is something that I've had a long-term relationship with and that continues, I think, to impact my way of feeling music, maybe even more than any other composer. But that's my experience with Byrd. That may not be someone else's. So again, I would encourage them, meaning other musicians, to take their own journey. And also, you did mention Stravinsky. He speaks to me very strongly as well. And I find endless inspiration and surprise in his music, as well as some of the more contemporary composers too, particularly in choral tradition. Now, to go back to your first question, how has the study of history and theory impacted my work as a composer? Well, history certainly has opened up my awareness of the repertoire and what composers have done. But on the other hand, it's made me aware of cyclical processes in history. So, for instance, if you look at the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and then the Baroque period, you will see fluctuations between very open, sort of unstructured experimental stages, and then followed by stages that are very controlled and measured, and there's a common practice, and there are strict rules to structure and musical form, etc. And it waxes and wanes over and over again as you go through the centuries. So that's made me sensitive to the question of, okay, what sort of a broad musical cultural stage are we in globally now in art music and in popular music? Given what we've seen in the large picture of history, what therefore could we expect to come next? That's a historical question you ask. Involving theory. Theory, in many cases, comes as a response to practice. So when you look at theoretical practices of description and notation and classification, they oftentimes are in response to the music of maybe a generation beforehand. So I think that it's very interesting seeing theory as a response to composition. But on the other hand, theory also gives you the tools to dive into earlier practices if you want to revisit them, or maybe respond to them somehow. Maybe you don't want to continue in the tradition, but you want to respond in opposition to them, or maybe you want to change one element of it and then explore some different aspect of it. Theory can help you do that, and for that reason, I think theory is very helpful. And also, and I think there perhaps are some limits to what I'm about to say, but in many cases, I also think that theory can help performers to relate to a work in terms of bringing out certain aspects of their structure, and also can help listeners. Now, if you're talking about in the Western classical tradition, I like to think of not notation. I like to think of theory being something that helps with listening, because we tend to use theory to inform how we listen to music. Whereas in jazz, theory can oftentimes help us as performers too, because we're improvising over chord changes, we're feeling the possibilities of melody and harmony and variations and ornamentation, etc. So depending on what traditions inform your practice, you could have a listening or a performing relationship with theory.
Okay. And just to kind of relate to that and kind of finish up, thinking about harmony and tonality might be considered musical flavors. Do you have a favorite flavor of chord, mode, or scale? Is there one that you find popping up in your music over and over again?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think that it really does, again, depend on the piece. if it's like cooking for me, if you know that there's a certain spectrum of flavors or textures that you want to use in your cooking, then there's a sense of how each individual ingredient is going to play a role within that universe you've constructed, that universe of flavor or of tone color. And so I think, for instance, if you are writing, let's say that you're writing a piece that's in a tonal language and you want to use a minor key, modulating to the relative major will provide a certain context to that flavor. But if you're writing a 12-tone composition and suddenly you have a major chord in the middle of that, it could be the same. It could be, let's say, a C major chord in the middle of a 12-tone composition versus a C major chord in the middle of a piece in A minor. That C major chord is going to have a different contextual significance in the phenomenology of how you're processing the experience of the music. So again, it all depends on the universe you're creating and what those individual ingredients are doing within that universe. So in a vacuum, I think it's hard to say. It's all based on context.
No, okay. You never decide, I really like Dorian mode or...
Oh, I love Dorian.
Of E flat major 7. I like both of those a lot.
Well, I do love Dorian mode. I love the neutrality of it. It's something that I think Western culture, being so influenced by the normalization of tonal music, revisiting the modes still provides something of a freshness that we can make use of and engage with. That's something that I would say Dorian mode is something that I find attractive. Also, I enjoy the effect of polytonality between closely related diatonic keys. Okay. I love false relations. For listeners and readers who might not be familiar, false relation is in a diatonic language, whether it's modal or tonal, it's the clash between a flat or a sharp version of a note and then a natural version of that same note. So let's say you have a piece in C major and you have a C against a C sharp. Now that C sharp could be behaving in a diatonic way in its own right, but it clashes with a C natural that's occurring in the same piece. So those sorts of relationships I find very fascinating because on the one hand, it's rooted in something that's very familiar, namely a diatonic logic to it. But on the other hand, it's two instances of notes behaving in independent diatonic ways, but together they create a friction with each other that I love the juxtaposition between the familiar and the strange. That's something that I find very fascinating because life is like that. Life is a juxtaposition between things that are very familiar and things that are always surprising and sometimes a little bit disorienting, but one hopefully has the faith and the hope that there will be a way to make sense of it and respond to it. So in the subliminal level, perhaps I'm predisposed to that sort of harmony in my own musical psyche for that reason.
I really love that, what you're talking about when you hear it in choral music. I love it when you have singers singing really tight intervals. It's so like a magical quality to it.
I agree. Yeah, that is something that's especially difficult to achieve with the human voice. It takes a great deal of voice leading skill as a composer to compose melodic lines for the voice that are natural to audiate and to produce with dissonances like that, especially chromatic dissonances. So I have the utmost respect for choral composers who are able to play that makes sense both audibly and in a way that's natural and performable for the ensemble.
Well, thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much.